Hello! Today I'm going to be looking at 2 sets of gouache and doing some paintings in my sketchbook. It's going to be quite a big video today with so much to talk about, so let's get into it! First up is a box of Winsor & Newton Designers Gouache. There are 6 tubes in here. This is a primary colour set. My box is very dinged, which was like that from Amazon, but the tubes are all intact and they are 14mm each. The colours are zinc white, primary yellow, primary red and primary blue. Then there's permanent green middle and ivory black. I'm going to be very glad for that green later on, as we'll see. But moving on to the other set of gouache, this is by Daniel Smith, a primary mixing set with titanium white, and I also bought a lamp black, or should I say Nick bought me these. Here are some of the other colours on the back, although I think they have expanded their colour range since then. There's even a sticker in the bag, which I thought was quite nice. As of time of recording, there are now 74 colours in the Daniel Smith gouache range, and there are 89 colours in Winsor & Newton Designers gouache range. I've also got a book for these which came in the box, so I'll just open this up. It has mixing information on one side and a colour chart on the other. And as for the difference between designer and fine artist gouache, I think it is really only who they're marketing the gouache to. So designers gouache for designers, illustrators, and fine art gouache is for more traditional or fine art artists. Let me know in the comments if you know the difference, because that's all I could find. But for Daniel Smith we have lamp black, titanium white, pyrrole red, Hansa yellow medium, and ultramarine blue. Both sets of gouache here are soluble in water and they will re-wet from being dry, but I'll come back to that later. I put this Daniel Smith sticker on one of my tote boxes where I keep some of my other stickers. And now let's move on to this water pot, which I bought in Kmart recently. It's really great. You can see it's got 2 chambers here, so I'm just going to put that over to one side. But in the lid part, if I can get the lid off the top, is a handy little palette, and I thought I would put my gouaches in here today. Daniel's up the top and Windsor's in the 3rd row. And hopefully I'll remember which is which, but I was just basically squeezing out a small amount of paint from each tube. This stuff is expensive, so I only use a little bit at a time. Now, the problem with gouache is that yes, it will dry and you can re-wet it, but it's never as good as when the paint is fresh out of the tube, and we'll see this later in the video because I did film this over a few days so you could see what happens when it dries out. And I was just rearranging the Winsor & Newton tubes so that the colours are in the same order and I can compare them directly. You might already see differences between the 2 reds and the blues because they are quite different pigments, and that actually worked out in my favour. Otherwise you can probably see I have a pretty limited palette here because the 2 sets are essentially the same in that they're a primary mixing set, but at least the Winsor & Newton has a green, so that's going to come in very handy. And of course now I can swatch in Becky's Swatchbook, which was my previous video. I've already stamped in the swatch boxes and written up all of the information, the names and the pigment numbers. Winsor & Newton tubes also had opacity boxes on them, so the black ones are fully opaque and the other 2 are semi-opaque. When it comes to gouache, the more opaque the better. I grabbed this set of watercolour brushes which were right next to me. They're by Meeden, and these should be fine for gouache. I do have specific gouache brushes, but really it doesn't matter too much because watercolour and gouache are very similar to each other. It's just that one is more opaque than the other usually. I was trying to decide which brush to go with, and I've gone for a medium-sized round brush here, so I'm just swatching the colours straight onto the paper without wetting it first. And we've got Daniel Smith's Hansa Yellow Medium, which is a PY74. In direct comparison is Winsor & Newton's Primary Yellow, which is also PY74, but it has PY138 mixed into it, and it is slightly more lemony than the Daniel Smith one, but they're very similar otherwise. Next up is Pyrrole Red. This one is absolutely gorgeous, PR254, and I was noticing with the Daniel Smith ones in particular that they are incredibly vibrant and have a lot of pigment in them. By comparison, Winsor & Newton's Primary Red is a PR170, and this one's a lot pinker, which you can see here. It's a really pretty colour, I like it a lot, but I did have issues with this one in particular drying in the palette. All of the paints so far are kind of opaque, but you can still see the black line showing through, so I'd say they're semi-opaque in this case. And this ultramarine blue by Daniel Smith feels more like a semi-transparent colour. It is very fine and is a standard PB29, but it does build up nicely in colour over time. And then we have primary blue in the Winsor & Newton. This is a PB15 or phthalo blue. This one's considered to be opaque, but you could definitely still see the line showing through, so you do have to put these on pretty thickly if you want nothing to show underneath. But it's a lot easier to do this in an actual painting. Titanium white by Daniel Smith is pretty opaque though. It's a PW6. It's my favourite white of all of them, although this zinc white PW5 is pretty good too by Winsor & Newton. It's quite nicely opaque as well. Maybe just not quite as much as titanium. Now with the two blacks, there is quite a difference between them. This lamp black by Daniel Smith is super opaque and it's really black. It doesn't really have any leaning toward warm or cool, maybe slightly towards the cooler side, but it's just a really solid black, and it's probably the darkest black you can get. Whereas ivory black PBK9 is definitely a warmer black, and it's relatively opaque but not so much as the lamp black. And I can see a browner tint coming through in the ivory black. And last up we have this extra one in the Winsor & Newton set, the permanent green middle, which is a mix of 3 pigments, and it's a really nice bright green. I like it a lot. On its own it's very bright, but it does mix in well with some of the other colours, as we'll see soon. Now that everything's dry, I'll bring them up a bit closer so you can see what they look like, and they definitely have a matte opaque look, especially the designer gouache. The extra fine gouache by Daniel Smith maybe not quite so much, but otherwise all of the colours went on nice and bright. The ultramarine blue's got quite a bit of granulation in it, and I've ended up with almost a split primary set with warm and cool blues and reds, which is very handy. The yellows are pretty much the same though. You can see how lamp black is a lot blacker than ivory black here, and that green is insanely bright. Before I get into the paintings, I thought it would be a good idea to do some mixing, and I'm going to do that in my sketchbook as well, because I do have a couple of pages in here which are very messy. There was a little bit of space on my test page. Because they're primary mixing sets, I was curious to know which secondary and tertiary colours I could make out of them, so I'm mixing up oranges and greens and purples with the different sets. I started out with the Daniel Smith ones. The 3 primaries are very much leaning towards the warm, so all of the mixes I got were pretty muted, which is what I was expecting, especially with the green and purple. But they're nice colours, it's just that it does become very limiting if you want to mix bright colours, which lean towards the cool, and that's just not possible when everything is warm. The black and the white made a nice neutral grey, and then I was trying to make a brown, just mixing in all 3 of the primary colours together. I think I got something in the end, although I really hate mixing browns. It's just so hard to get exactly what I want. I always end up with too much of one colour and just have to keep adding in other colours. It's very time consuming, and ain't no one got time for that. But anyway, I mixed up the 3 primary colours with white as well, just to get some more pastel shades. And overall, the Daniel Smith is quite a nice set, but it is pretty limited. Now going on to the Winsor & Newtons, and interestingly enough, all 3 of these ones are so much cooler, so I was able to make really nice bright mixes with the 3 primary colours. I'm really glad I have both sets of gouache, because now it makes a split primary set with the 3 warms and the 3 cools. You could probably see how much brighter the mixes are, especially this green. It's a lot more vibrant. So is the purple. It's an absolutely gorgeous colour, this one. I really love it. Even though I have mostly the same colours from both sets, they do produce completely different mixes, and now all of a sudden my colour palette has expanded considerably. That's definitely something to consider if you're looking for a primary mixing set to practice mixing colours. Definitely go for a split primary set, 2 reds, 2 yellows, 2 blues, warm and cool from each. It will just expand your ability to mix so much. And then I was just testing out all sorts of different colours here because I've got this extra green, and it was so much easier to mix a brown with the red, and also a lovely aquamarine colour there. I had a bit more space, so I just added in a few more mixes too. That extra green in the Winsor & Newton set made this whole set a lot lot more versatile when compared to the Daniel Smith one, which I found a lot more limiting. But the great thing is, because they're all water-soluble gouache, I can mix both sets together, it really doesn't matter, and that's what I'm going to do in my paintings once I've finished up with this little page here. I was able to get some lovely pastel shades with the white mixed in, so I'll just put an arrow down to that too. And here are all of my mixes once they're dry. You can see some granulation in the top ones, and that's with that ultramarine blue, whereas the ones in the Winsor & Newton set aren't granulating because there are no granulating pigments. But just from what I've mixed, there's a whole range of colours here, so I'm really happy about that. It was actually quite late in the day, so I decided to see if this gouache would stay wet overnight when I put the lid back on it. I've labelled the two sides with pen just so I remind myself in the morning, and I'll see if keeping it lidded keeps the paint wet. And the following day, I opened the lid up again. It's relatively airtight, but not completely so. It was enough to keep the paints wet though. Most of them were pretty much in exactly the same state as they were the previous day, but the Winsor & Newton Primary Red had started drying quite a lot more than the others. And I found that that one's probably the most problematic in the entire range. You can see me poking at it now. It was still somewhat damp though, so I was able to reactivate it in water easily enough. In my first picture today, I'm sketching out this rooster weather vane from a photo I took recently at a garden shop. I'll upload this photo to my Flickr account and you can use this if you would like. I'm drawing in the rooster, and I decided to simplify this picture quite a bit because when I started drawing in the northeast, south and west, it just looked really confusing. So I ended up just rubbing all of this part out, and I'm just going to keep the rooster on a stand like that. And for the rest of the picture, I loosely sketched in where I want the flowers and the foliage to be. I left out the building roofs and anything else that didn't appeal to me. And the rest of this painting is pretty much very loosely based off the reference photo, and I actually stopped looking at it after a while, so a lot of it is just made up. And the outcome is quite different to the photograph, which is perfectly fine with me. That's what I was going for. I've started painting very loose, watery colours here. I've been diluting the gouache down, as you can see in my mixing palette. I was pretty much doing an underpainting here, and I just wanted to get in blocks of colour so I could see where everything was, and then I can go on with the details afterwards. That primary red from the Winsor & Newton set is such a vibrant pink, and it was perfect for those flowers. And then the rest of the background is a mix of the Winsor & Newton green with various levels of yellow mixed in it to get that really bright area in the middle where the sun's shining, and then the slightly darker green around it. I've also gone in with a more muted green a bit later on, mixing in some of that Daniel Smith red in with the green. That neutralises it a bit, making it a more earthy colour. And if you add in more red, it will turn into brown. So it's quite versatile in that respect. And this is definitely where I was mixing the two brands of paints together to get all sorts of green. It would have been such a pain to mix those without that tube of green though, so I was very glad that was in there. And this is where I had moved away from the reference photo because I was adding in thicker layers of gouache, and there's so much detail in the photograph, it's just impossible to get it all, except if I wanted to be sitting here for 100 hours, and I'm far too impatient for that, so I'm going for a more impressionistic look, just dotting in different colours, yellows, greens, mixing it all together to make it look like there's a lot of different kinds of vegetation. Gouache is so great for layering because it does have that level of opacity. You can go over the top of other layers and it will show up, whereas watercolour not so much, it's just a bit too transparent. I guess if you used it thickly enough you could get somewhat of a level of opacity, but it's just not the same as gouache, which is just so much easier to use in that way. And once again, the thicker the gouache, the more opaque it will be, which is why I like to use gouache straight from the tube while it's wet, because it is so much easier to get a nice thick layer. As soon as you start adding water, it will dilute down and behave a lot more like watercolour. And I find that rewetting dry gouache never achieves the same level of opacity as using the gouache straight from tube while it's still wet. Gouache also dries a lot harder than watercolour as a rule, and so it will crack and fall out of half pans, at least in my experience. It doesn't matter the brand, it seems to happen with all of them. Let me know if you've had better success than I have with dry gouache. But this painting was such a mess for such a long time, I was wondering if I was going to pull it back. In this case, it was just a matter of being patient and adding those layers to get the desired effect. It took a little while to get there, and it definitely went through an ugly phase, especially with those blobby flowers, but once I started adding in a bit of highlight onto them, they started to look a lot better. Even though it was fairly complicated and took me much longer than I was anticipating, I really enjoyed painting this, and the colours of the gouache are so vibrant. Both sets of paint are really high quality, and I didn't have any issues with either of them, other than the Winsor & Newton Primary Red, which once it dried did not want to re-wet very well, so that was the most difficult of all of them. The other ones actually reactivated in water pretty easily though. If you're in Australia, I've often seen this Winsor & Newton set on super sale on Amazon. It's usually around $60 or $70, and I ended up paying about $34. So I'd say if you're interested in this set, definitely put it on your wish list and wait for one of those sales for it to pop up, and you'll get a nice big discount. The Daniel Smith set was about $56, and with the black paint I think it came to $70 something. They are not cheap, and each individual tube is about $20 or so depending on the series, so if I do collect more it will be slowly over time, and of course I'm always looking for sales when things are on good discounts. Once I was happy with the background, I'm now painting the rooster with a fairly thick layer of lamp black, so it becomes a silhouette. I also added some grey and white highlights just around the edges to make it look like the sun's hitting it, because in the photo it is backlit. I'm really glad I simplified the weather vane, because the northeast, south and west part just didn't look right when I drew it, so I left it out, and that's a reminder that you do not have to add everything from a photo into your paintings. Photos are there for reference, they don't have to be exactly the same unless that's the look you're going for. I'm not a hyper-realistic artist, I like mine more impressionistic, and I'm really happy with how this turned out. The colours are bright, I think it's a really fun painting, and I enjoyed this one a lot. You can see I've painted right to the borders of my sketchbook, so it's a bit messy. I don't have all these neat tape borders, but that's just how I like it. I of course still have some paint left, and some of them are really starting to dry now. So I actually left this for a few days because we had a long weekend and I wanted to take a bit of time off. But I was thinking I do want to do some other paintings, and I realised that my pot splits in two, so you can throw away the dirty water but keep the clean water. I love that so much. Most double pots you have to throw everything out and start again. But I left this for 3 days, and once I managed to get the lid off, we could see that yes, the paints have pretty much dried in the pot, so they don't keep for very long in this particular one. It isn't that airtight like some other ones are. You want one that has a rubber seal if you're going to keep it for a longer period of time. I thought this would be a good test though, to see how well the dried gouache reactivates in water, and I'm giving it a helping hand by dripping on some water to get it activated rather than just using a wet brush straight away, because gouache does take a little bit more time to get wet again in my experience. And because I've only got a tiny amount of gouache left in this palette, that also does affect how it's going to reactivate in water. I think a bigger amount of gouache will actually mix up better. These smaller amounts maybe not so much. But over the 3-day holiday, I'd actually started a page in one of my other sketchbooks. I'm trying to get through this one as well, and I'd painted all of the background in watercolours with the idea that I'll paint over the top with gouache, and this is my 2025 page. It's such a mess, but I actually really like the colours, and I wanted to continue those colours over to make a full page spread. So I've drawn in some cockatoos, and then I painted over some layers of watercolour from my Schminker palette, and now I'm going to paint some white gouache over the top to get these cockatoos in. It's mostly titanium white with a bit of the zinc white in as well, just so I could use it up. Now honestly, this was an experiment. I'd never really done this before, and I was thinking to myself, it's not going very well. You can see how the pink is really showing through underneath that gouache, so even though the gouache is opaque, it's not super opaque because I've re-wet it from dry and I've had to use quite a bit of water mixed in with it. I was thinking it was a bit of a disaster, but I did paint over a few more layers and it got better. The black was perfectly fine, that's re-wet with no issues and it's nice and dark, but I used so much of the white gouache on this one bird and I was thinking I'm going to have to squeeze more gouache out for the rest of the birds. And that is probably my biggest gripe with a lot of tube sets. I really wish that they'd give you either 2 white tubes or a tube of white that's double the size of all of the other colours, because white gouache is the one I use the most, probably twice as quickly as any other colour, and I know this is the same for a lot of other artists. So I always try to stock up on white gouache in particular. Aside from my nitpicking, this was actually a really fun painting to do, starting off with a wash of watercolours like I've done here, and then going in with an opaque paint over the top is quite effective because you get a lovely transparent background in contrast with the foreground, which is the opaque detail. And I think this might work out even better with acrylic paint over watercolour, so that's something I'm definitely going to experiment with in the future. But I was determined to do this entire one in the gouache, so I just ended up squeezing out more white as I needed it, but otherwise I was using some of the leftover gouache that I'd re-wet, mostly white, black and yellow for the parrots because that's the colour that they are, and you can see some of the background colours showing through in the feathers, which in the end I decided I quite liked, so I didn't cover the birds entirely with white, I did let some of that background show. I love experimenting with paints, colours, techniques, and I'm trying to do that a bit more this year. Last year I was stuck in a bit of a creative rut, so this year I'm trying to push the boundaries a bit and get out of my comfort zone to broaden my skills and general art horizons. Some of the things I do will probably not work, and I didn't think this was going to work to begin with, but I did persevere with it and I'm actually really happy with the outcome. I think the cockatoos look really cute. This is also from a photo I took and I'll put this up for you to reference as well. The background of course is completely different. Like I said, it doesn't have to be the same as the photo. Now, the most tedious part of this painting was the wall that they were sitting on. I wanted to paint it brown, and of course I've got no brown in either set, so I've had to mix this up, and I couldn't get the colour I wanted. It was just an endless mixing session of red and green to get the right balance, and I ran out of paint about 3 times and had to try and match it, which is why you can see there are slight differences in the brown, which isn't that big of a deal. In fact, it probably makes it look more interesting rather than being the same flat colour. But gosh, I get impatient when it comes to mixing colours, especially when I'm trying to make a lot of it, and it's really hard to replicate a colour if you run out. So for me, mixing is a bit of a chore, it always has been. I like to have convenience colours, and if I was to buy another Daniel Smith colour, it would be the brown. But here's the finished painting. I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out, although I'm not so keen on the white gouache. I think white acrylic paint would be much better, but it was a fun experiment and it turned out better than I was expecting. This is my Hannah Mueller sketchbook and I just really like the colours in this page spread. I think it's turned out really fun. I'm working through this book off camera just to finish it because I don't like the paper very much, but going back to my other sketchbook and I had this blank page, I cannot leave it like this, so I'm going to try and use as much leftover gouache as possible. I had so much ultramarine and I really wanted to paint with this one. It looks so much more beautiful in this particular sketchbook than it did on my little swatch. I guess because when I was swatching it was drying pretty quickly and I was getting patchy colour, whereas I'm using a lot more water and a bigger brush here to get as much gouache on this page as possible. I of course ran out of ultramarine before I ran out of page. I keep forgetting how big this book is, and so I ended up finishing off the page with the other blue, which is that phthalo blue. They actually mixed quite well together, and it's at this point where I decided that it's going to be a seascape because there's a definite line in the middle there, which is the horizon line. So I've got the ocean in the front and the sky in the back, and now I'm just mixing in some of the zinc white just to make that blue go a little bit further so it's fading off onto one side. And in order to make this look a little bit more logical, I am painting in some very subtle cloud shapes. Now this whole painting is a bit patchy because I've only put one layer of paint on. I really didn't want to have to paint another layer and squeeze out more paint, so it's just going to be as it is. This is just kind of a use it up page. I didn't want to leave it blank, and I also didn't want to leave my paint in the palette So I'll chuck it on a page and see what I end up with. Even though I've been doing full paintings in this sketchbook, I am still treating it like a sketchbook, so some of the pages are probably not going to be as finished as others. I don't need every single page to be a masterpiece. I just want to have fun with it, and some pages are definitely going to be more sketchy than others. I'm adding in some foreground here with some of the leftover green, and that one re-wet nicely. I didn't have any issues with that. I still have a lot of that Daniel Smith red, and I painted this on as thickly as possible. You can see it is nicely opaque and it's sitting over the top of the blue quite well without taking too much of the blue tinge underneath. Just a little bit, but that's okay. These are made up flowers. I don't know what they are. Becky flowers. I was going to do hibiscuses, but I was just too lazy to go and look for a reference, so these squiggly lines kind of look like flowers in the end. I added in some yellow just for a bit of stamen action, and throwing on a bit of highlight as well. I love these sorts of paintings where I don't really have to think. I just start adding paint to the page and it ends up being something eventually. This type of painting is one of my go-to ones when I can't think of anything else as well. Very quick and easy, maybe about half an hour to do the whole thing, and here's the finished piece. It's a bit patchy, but I actually really like how it turned out. The gouache colours are still nice and vibrant, and I think it looks quite nice with my other more finished piece. It's a vibrant page spread, and this Ohuhu sketchbook took gouache incredibly well. The pages haven't buckled. I added a lot of paint and water on here, and it's holding up perfectly. So this mixed media paper also holds gouache, along with pens, and I'm definitely going to do some watercolours in here soon. Probably some acrylic paint as well. Here's the other painting I did in my Hannah Muller sketchbook, and overall I'm really happy with how much I was able to achieve in this particular painting session, although this was over a few days. I like both sets of gouache. I think they're excellent, and together they make a pretty decent palette, although I really wish I had a brown as well. That would just make life so much easier. I don't even know if I could pick just one set because I like colours from both of them. And I still have gouache left over in this palette. I'll probably stick this in one of my other sketchbooks because I refuse to waste any paint. So in conclusion, both brands of gouache are great. You can't go wrong with either one, depending on whichever's cheaper in your neighbourhood and more readily available. I'm just putting the Daniel Smith tubes in this little case for now. I'll probably find a better home for this soon though. And the Winsor & Newtons can stay in their box. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think. And do you prefer one set over the other? If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and you might like to click the subscribe button for more videos. I'll pop a couple of other videos up here for you to watch. And I hope you're all having a fantastic day out there. I'll see you really soon in my next video. Swatch you later. Bye!